Well, good morning, everyone, or good afternoon and evening, depending on where you are joining us from for today's virtual event. My name is Dr. Clint Work. I'm Fellow and Director of Academic Affairs here at the Korea Economic Institute, or KEI. And we want to welcome you to today's event on NATO and the Indo-Pacific Partners, or IP4, as they're often referred to. And this includes, please excuse our coffee machine in the background. This includes Japan, the Republic of Korea, or South Korea, Australia, and New Zealand. And NATO and the IP4's relationship, of course, has received increased attention and prominence of late, but it's evolving very quickly. I think still misunderstood by policymakers and general public alike, and could go different directions in the future. So we want to examine some of those potential directions and also where it's come from in today's event. But before we get started, I do want to highlight a few materials, links to which we will put in our virtual chat box as I speak. One is KEI's August 2023 panel event titled NATO, Korea, and Japan Developing Partnerships, which examined the ITPP agreements between NATO and Korea and NATO and Japan, the Individual Tailored Partnership Program agreements, about a year ago. With our KEI's Vice President, Mark Tokala, as the moderator. Also, KEI President and CEO Scott Snyder's recent article in The Diplomat titled What South Korea Can Accomplish at NATO to Help End the War in Ukraine, though written before the recent summit, still has relevant insights and shelf life beyond it. And then also the U.S. Institute for Peace report on the expert study group on NATO and Indo-Pacific Partners, for which one of our speakers, Mirna Galic, served as the chair. It's a very informative report, and I would highly encourage people to read it. Today's event, of course, does center on NATO, Indo-Pacific Four relations, but as a Korea-focused institute, I'd be remiss if I didn't point out several specific historical links between NATO member states, the Indo-Pacific Four, and the Korean Peninsula. First, the Korea War broke out in 1950, I think as most of us know, just 1 year after the North Atlantic Treaty was signed. And the war really helped spur the North Atlantic Treaty allies, the members, to transform the North Atlantic Treaty into the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, literally putting the O in NATO, as Secretary General Stoltenberg is fond of saying. And this involved creating the position of Secretary General, standing up a permanent military headquarters, and appointing a Supreme Allied Commander in Europe. So NATO's history and security is long related to the Korean Peninsula and by extension, the region. Second, I think importantly, during the war, there were 16 sending states that sent military forces to defend South Korea under the US-led United Nations Command, or UNC, and 5 other states which sent humanitarian and or medical assistance to Korea. 8 of those 16 sending states were either founding or very early members of NATO, and additionally, Denmark, Italy, and Norway, which were also founding NATO members, and Sweden, one of the more recent entrants to NATO, were among the states that sent humanitarian assistance. Third, of course, South Korea's one and only treaty ally, the United States, was arguably the driving force behind NATO's creation and remains critical to defense and deterrence in both the Euro-Atlantic and Indo-Pacific regions. And fourth, North Korea's nuclear missile program has been a regular subject of NATO summit declarations and North Atlantic Council statements since 2006. And it's also one of the first issues around which NATO and the IP4 informally began to meet years ago. But setting aside that brief, very Korea-centric history lesson, we're here today to discuss broader and more contemporary developments. Although NATO involvement with Asia or the Indo-Pacific goes back years, and its bilateral relationship with each individual IP4 country goes back to the early 2000s, if not the 1990s, the IP4 as a grouping and its growing prominence in NATO summits and declarations is a more recent phenomenon. And it's one that's directly interconnected with the broadening of NATO's own strategic aperture. And this was a process that really gained momentum in the late 2010s amidst growing invocations of great power competition, and that has picked up considerable speed with Russia's revisionist war in Ukraine, a growing perception and characterization of China as a systemic challenge to global security, an increasing linkage between those two, and of course, more recently, deepening Russia-North Korea ties. So NATO has now explicitly and repeatedly links Indo-Pacific and Euro-Atlantic security. using a strategic narrative of shared transnational threats and shared values. And this is a framing that's also embraced and increasingly mentioned to different degrees by various IP4 leaders. So today we want to discuss these developments from various angles, including the nature of NATO partnerships in general, and the NATO IP4 partnership in particular, some of the background and motivations among the IP4 countries in their relationship with NATO, what NATO and the IP4 countries sought out of the recent Washington Summit, and what are some of the key takeaways and outcomes for these different stakeholders, and what might the future hold for NATO IP4 relations? What are some of the realistic opportunities ahead, and what are some of the challenges they face? And also, how mutual is the relationship? And might we see NATO adopt a more prominent role, not just with the Indo-Pacific, but in the Indo-Pacific? It's a question that many are asking. And more issues as well. We've got a great set of panelists to discuss them. Now, joining us on the screen and from NATO's headquarters in Brussels is Kristian Meszaros. Hopefully I pronounced that well, Kristian. NATO's Director for Partnerships and Global Affairs. Here at the table with me, Mirna Galic, Senior Policy Analyst for China and East Asia at the U.S. Institute for Peace, or USIP. Dr. Hyun Ji Rim, Lecturer for Strategic Studies and the Masters in Global Policy Program at the School of Advanced International Studies, or SAIS, at Johns Hopkins University. And also joining us on the screen, Kathryn Paik, Senior Fellow with the Australia Chair at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, or CSIS, joining us from what looks like a beautiful mountain redoubt in the state of Vermont. Their longer bios are on our website, so please feel free to check them out there. They're all long and impressive backgrounds, and they all do very interesting research that I suggest people look into. But I want to jump right into it. Just our run of show will be a moderated discussion among myself and our panelists, both here and online. And then we'll turn to an audience Q&A. So if you do have questions as we go through our conversation, please feel free to post them in our virtual chat box, and we will assemble them before we turn to our audience. But I want to start with NATO headquarters in Brussels. Kristian, could you provide some general context on NATO's partnerships, sort of in general, its relations with non-member countries and international organizations, and then more specifically on the NATO IP4 partnership?
Sure, and thank you very much, Clint. Thank you for the Korea Economic Institute and for organizing this event and including us in it. It's truly a privilege to be here with this distinguished panel and you. And it's also very timely because, as you know, the summit took place last week, 75th anniversary. So there's a lot to unpack there and to discuss also for our partnership with the Indo-Pacific 4. Now, you went back to the 1950s. I just wanted to start our story in the early 1990s, but I'm very glad you mentioned the Korea War and what the Secretary General says that led to the creation of his job in a way. And I think it's important to keep in mind that such historic developments give a spur to international organizations and international cooperation, because in some ways we're witnessing the same kind of induced international cooperation now. But then let's move from the 50s to the 90s. And why? Because NATO's partnerships, of course, go back to early 1990s. I'm kind of a geek of NATO enlargement and NATO partnerships because of my nationality. I'm Hungarian. And Hungary was one of the countries in Central and Eastern Europe that, after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the socialist system, was seeking NATO and EU membership. And this is what fundamentally then galvanized NATO into finding a substitute at that point for enlargement, which was partnership and partnership for peace. That was the first partnership instrument. So the origins of partnership goes back to the interest and the push from Central and Eastern European countries to become members of NATO. Now, what does partnership fundamentally offer? It's two things. One is political dialogue, and the second, practical cooperation. And all our partnerships are based on that. Of course, political dialogue is exchanging views, increasing situational awareness and understanding for situations, and practical cooperation. Well, That encompasses several different kind of activities, anything from English language courses to increase interoperability, all the way to high-end exercises. So a lot of different kind of activities that we can do together with partners. So political dialogue on the one hand and practical cooperation. And the second thing I would want to say about partnerships, that it's not NATO going out and seeking partners, just like NATO is not seeking out new members, but it's countries that come to NATO to work with NATO, if not wanting to join, as European countries, you know, based on Washington Treaty can, but to work with NATO, to learn from NATO. So it's always based on the interest of countries that come to NATO, how the partnership looks like, what the political dialogue includes, and what the practical cooperation includes as well. Why are we interested in partnership? It's very simple. Partnership contribute to our own security. They also increase stability around NATO's borders and globally. And they support our core tasks. NATO has 3 core tasks. Number 1 is, of course, deterrence and defense, but also crisis prevention and crisis management, and third, cooperative security. And partners and partnerships contribute to all those three core tasks. Then, of course, in 2024, partnerships is very different from 1994. And the reason is that there are many threats and challenges that we face from a lot of countries around the world. And we just simply cannot meet them alone, because they know no borders and they're really important transnational challenges. Think of terrorism, think of cyber threats, cyber security, hybrid attacks, climate change, and its implications on security. So there are a lot of threats and challenges that we face in common from many countries around the world. So I mentioned already the Partnership for Peace, which was the first format or group for partnerships. We also have distinctive formats with countries in North Africa and the Middle East. That's the Mediterranean Dialogue, as well as a specific format with countries, 4 countries in the Gulf region. That's the Istanbul Cooperation Initiative. These are the 3 formats where we meet with partners. But then, of course, we have individual cooperation with each of our partners. Today, we count around 35 countries across the globe as NATO's partners, as well as international organizations. And you mentioned that, Clint, as well. I will just mention a cooperation with the United Nations, and of course, our strategic partner, the European Union, as examples. So among these 35 countries, we have, of course, the 4 countries from the Indo-Pacific, and you mentioned them. And you also alluded to the fact that these partnerships go back. In fact, even beyond the 1990s, my colleagues here have dug up articles from the 1980s where Japan was seeking to engage with the North Atlantic Council. So indeed, these are long-standing individual partnerships, which are not linked, as you rightly outlined, to necessarily developments in the late 2010s, but they were spurred and increased since. I would say that the first real impetus for cooperation was given by Afghanistan and NATO's operation in Afghanistan, where these partners provided very important financial, but even troop contributions, and we worked very closely together, again, based on our common interests and common values. Then, with all 4 countries, we have practical cooperation, which is laid down in our individually tailored partnership programs. These outline the concrete activities that we do together. You rightly mentioned that we started to meet as a grouping with the 4 countries around 2016, and the main topic indeed was the reckless activities, missile tests, nuclear tests of North Korea. So that was the first issue we discussed as part of the grouping. But then increasingly since 2021, when NATO decided to take a more global approach, we have discussed other issues and other concerns as they arose within this format. And then, as I mentioned, we do political dialogue with the 4 countries, but with each individually as well as practical cooperation, individually through the individually tailored partnership program, but also with the 4 together through the agenda for tackling shared security challenges, where we look exactly at these transnational threats and challenges that I mentioned, so cyber, the emergence and the misuse of emerging and disruptive technologies, climate change, countering disinformation, and so on. So I would say that with the Indo-Pacific 4, our partnership, the strong foundation of our partnerships, of course, are shared values, but also shared interests, and the challenges that we face together. Then let me highlight one more thing, which I think shows best that we share the same values and shared interests, is the support that these 4 countries have given to Ukraine as it faces the war of aggression from Russia. I think that's the best example you can use, that countries from the other side of the globe invest so much in the security of Europe and Ukraine, that we do share the same values and the same interests. So I will leave it at there, but I'm sure we'll discuss all of these issues throughout this meeting.
Thank you, Kristian, very much. That was a very nice sort of comprehensive overview of NATO's partnerships in general, but really the main drivers behind the IP4 as well, NATO's cooperation with the IP4, that is. I want to turn to our other panelists to talk more specifically about those countries' perspectives and provide some background on each of their individual relationships with NATO, because as Kristian mentioned, though there is the IP4 grouping and other partnership groupings, the bedrock of these relationships still remain the individual bilateral ties that they have with NATO as an organization. So I've given a specific order. I've asked Hyun Ji if you might talk a bit about the ROK's, how its relationship has developed with NATO. What are some of the interests and motivations that have driven the development of its relationship with Brussels?
Yes, thank you for having me today. So RK and NATO's relationship, as it's been mentioned earlier, has historically a special relationship dating back to the Korean War. And the UNC still exists. It still stands in South Korea, serving the function of armistice maintenance. And Yoon administration is exploring the further role of UNC going forward. The President Yoon Suk-yeol was the first South Korean president to attend NATO in 3 consecutive years. For South Korea, NATO has been a testing ground as South Korea's economic development. South Korea economically develops and plays a role as a more responsible global player in the international arena. NATO cooperation with NATO has been a testing ground for South Korea to explore different aspects of how to expand South Korea's role in the international community, how to solidify the U.S. RK-U.S. alliance, and the other regional and global partnerships. So it has been very successful past 3 years for the Yoon administration. In the beginning, like Dr. Work mentioned, the relationship between NATO members and South Korea has been bilateral. But recently, the NATO and South Korea relationship has really flourished. And the relationship has grown to adapt to changing geostrategic pressure and security environment on the Korean Peninsula and in the Indo-Pacific, and of course, globally. The inflection point, I guess, was really the Russian invasion of Ukraine and evolving U.S. Indo-Pacific strategy in the context of intensifying U.S.-China strategic competition and the growing threats from developments regarding China, Russia, and North Korean relations. And most recently, the DPRK and Russian Comprehensive Strategic Partnership was really what pushed South Korean government to further pursue and more actively pursue the cooperation with all these allies and partners and NATO.
Thank you. Mirna, from the Japanese perspective, I know you've, with your working group experience, spoken with a lot of Japanese analysts and maybe government as well, maybe just analysts and scholars. So you have, I think, a nice perspective on this.
Yes, well, thank you so much for having me. Yeah, I actually think Japan is one of the fun case studies of IP4 relations, because even though of all the IP4 partners, Japan up until 2016 had extremely limited authorities for its military forces, and even now, compared to the others, has very limited authorities for what its security forces can do. Despite this, Japan was the very first of NATO's engagement partners in the region, and as Kristian alluded to, actually the first sort of known contact goes back to 1983, when the Japanese were seeking a consultation mechanism with NATO as a way to sort of feed input into European discussions about Russian missile reductions, because the fear in Japan was that if the Soviets reduced their missiles in Europe, they would scoot them over to Asia, because of course the Soviet Union spanned both regions. Unfortunately, France scuttled that request, and France will come back later into Japan's NATO relationship. But that was kind of a first sort of area where Japan really started looking at NATO. And again, because Japan's kind of security forces at that time were extremely limited, from the very beginning of its engagement with NATO, Japan saw NATO as sort of a power center, a political power center for discussions with Europe and the United States, and also from the security side. And so that's actually quite unique, because I think for them, that notion that NATO is sort of a platform for engaging with Europe and for pushing views of, or not pushing, but sharing views of security with Europe has been very longstanding. So back in 1993, Japan and NATO start their first official engagement, and this is through high-level consultations. These happen intermittently to this day. But the real practical cooperation between Japan and NATO doesn't take off until the NATO-led mission in Afghanistan, ISAF. In 2007, Japan starts to fund provincial reconstruction team projects through ISAF. And it's also in parallel to NATO raising money for Afghanistan's economy, and along with NATO contributing funds that NATO is trying to raise for the Afghan National Security Forces. So again, even though Japan is not committing militarily to the ISAF mission, it's very much working in line with NATO. And as a result, starting in 2008, it begins to get invited to all of the NATO summit sessions on Afghanistan. And then this kind of goes forward. In 2009, NATO begins its counter-piracy mission in the Indian Ocean. So NATO has actually had a mission in the Indo-Pacific, which I think we often forget. And that mission was cooperated with not only by Japan, New Zealand, Korea, and Australia, but also by China, which is really fascinating. So in that sense, sort of Japan and NATO in 2009 start doing some passing exercises as part of this mission. And in 2014, they sign their individually tailored partnership program, or their individually, I can't remember the acronym, IPCP, which is the original ITP. And that sort of starts the officialness, I suppose, of the partnership between Japan and NATO. But from there, it sort of continues kind of percolating along up until 2019, I think, when you have NATO recognizing that China is a security threat for the alliance. And then 2022, when you have the war in Ukraine beginning. And these two things also really sort of catalyze a desire to deepen the relationship with NATO on the part of Japan. And directly to some of the things we're seeing today.
Thank you, Mirna. Yeah, the point about leading counter-piracy and sort of maritime security exercises in the Indo-Pacific, I was myself unaware of that until some of the preparation for this event. It goes back to 2008, if I'm not mistaken.
2009 to 2016, I think.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Well, Kathryn, you're in Vermont, but we've asked you to elucidate the perspectives from Canberra and Auckland, respectively.
Yes, thanks. And thanks so much for having me. I completely agree that this is not a recent development in terms of the IP4 countries and their involvement with NATO and their interest. It was mentioned earlier, this idea of interest and values being aligned. And I think as those have evolved over time, so too has the motivations for really strengthening these relationships. I mean, in Australia's case, it goes back quite significantly. As much as the 1950s and 1953, Australia was participating in a NATO exercise Cornet, a physical demonstration against Soviet expansion. And then conversations between Australia and NATO have gone on for quite some time, more formalized in the 2000s, and then as a more formalized partner in 2013, and then more recently getting their individually tailored partnership program in 2023. But again, I think this has been very much aligned with Australia's growing engagement, not only with NATO, but the European partners across the board, and a desire on Australia's part to bring European partners more into the Indo-Pacific and to cooperate more broadly with them. We've seen extensive cooperation over the last several years between different regions, including Europe, on issues like the Pacific Islands, in Southeast Asia, all coming down to a greater strategic alignment between not just the US and Australia, but Australia and many other partners across the world. And Australia's realization that their national security is very much tied in with that of Europe. New Zealand, very similar trajectory, not quite as deep and long of a history, but really going back much dialogue and cooperation from the early 2000s. And then a similar timeline to Australia in terms of the official partnership and the ITTP or ITPP. Again, from New Zealand's perspective, very similar evolution of kind of a recognition of this alignment of strategic imperatives based on some of the geostrategic developments in the Indo-Pacific. And then, of course, we've had over the last few years the Russia's war in Ukraine and how that has affected the Indo-Pacific. I think from at least Australia and New Zealand's perspective, as IP4 members, they see a clear connection between what happens in Europe affecting that of the Indo-Pacific. They would also, I think, assert that there is a strong connection between what happens in the Indo-Pacific, including in the South China Sea and the Pacific Islands region, and what happens in Europe, and that those affect European national security. And I think their interest in engaging in the IP4, in the NATO FARA, really comes down to continuing to demonstrate that connectivity and the usefulness of this partnership for both sides, not just for the Asian partners.
Thank you, Kathryn. So I'll first address you, Kristian, with this question, but I want to hear from all our panelists, which is turning specifically to the recent 75th NATO Summit last week here in DC. And what did each of these stakeholders seek from the summit, and what are some of the key outcomes from their perspectives from the summit? And so, of course, NATO as a whole, Kristian, and please correct me if I'm wrong, obviously deterrence and defense in Europe, support for Ukraine were key planks in the summit, sort of primary ones. But I don't want you to not speak to those, but maybe if you could talk specifically what it sought in terms of the IP4 in regard to the recent summit and some of the key outcomes in that partnership.
Sure, thank you. And I think it's important to mention those three key pillars together because they make sense together and they explain much more the narrative that was coming out from the 75th anniversary summit, as you said. But before that, can I just say how impressed I am how NATO acronyms like IPCP, the Individual Partnership Cooperation Program, which comes from a different era, but also Operation Ocean Shield. I remember the name of the piracy mission off the coast of Somalia, but I didn't remember when it was, but my able colleague checked. It was from 2009 to 2016. So indeed, a mission in the Indian Ocean at a very different time with very interesting players, as you mentioned. But then on the summit, as you mentioned, the three key things was, of course, boosting deterrence and defense. This is nothing new. It started in 2014, the biggest reinforcement of NATO's collective defense as a response to then Crimea. And of course, after 2022, even with more increased urgency, with new defense plans and increased defense spending. You have all heard the story of already 23 allies meeting the 2% goal that we have for defense spending. Then support to Ukraine, including a financial pledge, a stronger NATO role in security assistance and training for Ukraine, support for increasing interoperability, all of this creating a package that forms a bridge towards future membership, because Ukraine's future is in NATO. And the third key element from the summit was increased partnerships. And here the Indo-Pacific partners, along with the European Union, were very important for two reasons. One is, of course, the leaders were again present. This was the third summit in a row where the 4 leaders were invited. And together with the European Union leadership. And I think it's important to recognize that that group, there's always a specific session at the NATO summit, along with the NATO-Ukraine Council and the meeting of the 32 allied leaders. The third session is in this grouping. And I think it expresses the interest of this specific group of countries in upholding the rules-based international order and messaging that, but also talking about it amongst themselves. And again, this third summit underscored this shared commitment to strengthening and upholding the international rules-based order. Then something more happened at this third summit compared to the other ones. We agreed concrete flagship projects that we will work on. And I think that's important. The summit meeting in itself, the meeting isn't the message, that is true, but it's also important to show and use the impetus from a summit to create more practical cooperation and opportunities, which then, of course, serve the main narrative of supporting the international rules-based order. The flagship projects, they're known, they're supporting Ukraine in medical, military healthcare in Ukraine, artificial intelligence, countering disinformation, whether from Russia, China, and other sources, and cyber defense. And then you will see, of course, from these as well, how there's transnational threats we're trying to reply together to. You have also seen the summit declaration, which included messages on partnerships on Ukraine, deterrence and defense, but also on China. And I think we will talk about that in more detail. Mirna also mentioned that in 2019 is the first time that you saw the mention of China in a NATO document. That was the London Leaders Meeting Declaration. I will just correct, it did not identify China as a threat to NATO. That is not the case. NATO is facing 2 threats, Russia and terrorism. But China was seen as a challenge and as an opportunity. And then since 2019, this narrative has continued, but you have seen, as a response to China's assertive actions and coercive policies, the focus on the challenge has increased, again, as a response to what China has done in Europe and in the Euro-Atlantic security. So that's what you saw again from this summit, identifying how China continues to challenge our security values and interests.
Kathryn, you've been very patient and waiting, so I want to turn to you first with the same question. If you could sort of elaborate on Australia and New Zealand's, sort of what they saw and some of the key takeaways for them from this summit.
Yeah, exactly. I think what was just mentioned about the meeting not being the message, but yet that it being important in and of itself, I think is a key point here. Just the meeting of IP4 again for the third time at the highest level, the institutionalization of that grouping, the demonstration of the importance of that grouping. You know, I think we also can't ignore, and I know we'll talk later about the U.S. piece here in terms of the U.S. being involved or not. But I don't think we can ignore the need from Australia and New Zealand to ensure that these relationships are solidified and strengthened, regardless of where the U.S. is sitting in terms of needing the IP4 or pushing the IP4 forward. And I think from that perspective, those countries would have seen some great messaging coming out of this most recent summit. As was mentioned, the evolving language around China, the calling out of Beijing, and the support for Russia. I think that was very important from these countries' perspective, because it showed that, again, that connectivity of the theaters and what happens in Asia and what China is doing does affect the European security. Also the connection of North Korea's involvement and shipping of weapons to Russia to use in Ukraine. I think, again, those were important points for these countries to see. I think also on the other side, the deepening collaboration on technology, on disinformation and cyber are going to be important moving forward. And again, I know we'll talk a little bit more later on about the future of NATO and what these countries and the IP4 and what they might be looking for. But I think as the cooperation on those very critical issues from Australia and New Zealand's perspective continue to deepen and be strengthened with NATO, I think that will be seen as a positive development from Australia and New Zealand. Again, they see these as transnational, transregional threats that are affecting them very significantly. We've seen recent news from both Australia and New Zealand in terms of their willingness and their recognition of especially China's disinformation and cyber efforts in their own countries. So these are very top of mind for both Australia and New Zealand. And I think coming out of the NATO summit, seeing those as top line issues of cooperation and collaboration between the IP4 and NATO will be seen as a very important development from these countries. So they'll be looking for more of the same and hopefully a strengthening of all these vectors of cooperation into the future.
Thank you, Kathryn. Mirna, could you talk about Japan's objectives and sort of key takeaways?
Sure. Well, I think it's a little bit, we don't necessarily have to separate out the four countries. I think a lot of the objectives are fairly aligned in terms of what they wanted out of the summit. So I'll just sort of speak to the general case. But basically, I think what's super interesting about the summit, again, that a lot of people don't necessarily know, is that on the sidelines of this NATO summit, just as in the past two cases with both Madrid and Vilnius, the IP4 held a quadripartite forum, like on their own without NATO participation, to discuss how they want to cooperate as the IP4. That happened this time under New Zealand's informal leadership. The first one was under Japan's and the second was under Korea's. Last year in Vilnius, they issued a statement on Korea. This year, again, they issued a statement on North Korea. In this particular statement, they have focused a lot on North Korea's military support for Russia. Obviously, it's something that none of them are pleased with and NATO also isn't happy about. And so I think that's quite a useful thing, because in addition to what these partners get out of attending the NATO forum in terms of bilateral opportunities for engagement, in terms of being able to be seen on the world stage as strong partners of NATO, they are also having greater opportunities to coordinate among one another as the IP4, which they don't really do in the region so much. They could, and we may talk about that later, where this relationship will evolve, but so far they haven't so much been. They've met once, I think, on the sidelines of a Korean defense meeting, but we'll see where that goes. And then in terms of Japan, what they probably were super happy about, I think Kathryn mentioned, the summit declaration actually specifically calls out DPRK's support to Russia's military efforts and its fueling of weapons to Russia for the war in Ukraine. And also, for the first time, I think, uses some new language on China as being a decisive enabler of the Russia's war in Ukraine. And then it echoes, again, previous language on China. And Kristian is right. My characterization earlier of the 2019 document was my words. NATO has some very specific language on China, which I encourage you all to look at, because I think those documents are quite interesting, including the strategic concept from 2022. And then additionally, I would also say the IP4 had a great chance to talk with the US side. They met with Kurt Campbell, and they met, I think, at some point, actually, I'm not sure if they met with Biden, but the White House issued a fact sheet on IP4 cooperation, which is, again, good because it kind of shows these partners are in the mainstream. And I think just in general, why are the partners always at these summits? For various reasons, but I think, again, it's to underscore, as Kathryn keeps saying, that the ties between security ties between the Indo-Pacific and the Euro-Atlantic are becoming stronger and stronger, and that the effects that great powers in one region are having there play out in the other region and vice versa. And that's really been like especially from the Japanese side, a long-standing line that they've been pushing, that what's happening in our region is equally important for you as what's happening in your region is important for us. So.
Hyun Ji.
Yes. South Korea, for this NATO summit, went in with, in my opinion, with three clear goals. First one was to clearly show where Seoul stands And second is to kind of bring the international attention to the illicit DPRK Russia cooperation and the comprehensive strategic partnership. And the third one is to kind of announce Seoul's commitment to further strengthening the ties with NATO. So to go in a little deeper, President Yoon had announced South Korea's Indo-Pacific strategy in 2022, and it was under immense criticism that South Korea is not committing enough, that it wasn't taking a firmer stance against China compared to other Indo-Pacific actors like Japan and Australia. And the summit was a great opportunity for South Korea to reconfirm its commitment to upholding universal values and the rule-based international order, and to show that Seoul stands with its allies. And it's been the third year that President Yoon has been going to the summit. And first two, Korea was kind of feeling getting the feel for it. But third year, this year, Korea was able to more actively come out with suggestions like digital solidarity and push for more concrete action plans with the IP4 states. And second, bringing the illicit DPRK Russia comprehensive strategic partnership to NATO's attention and call for the solidarity and international support. So if you look at all the statements and speeches made by South Korean officials during the summit, they always mention this DPRK-Russia relations. So this was very important for South Korea. And South Korea did so by strongly condemning Russia of violating UNSC resolution and by reiterating the concerning effect that DPRK would have on already a prolonged war in Ukraine via its artillery, ammunition, and short-range rocket supplies to Russia. So I'm not sure if everyone is familiar with this new partnership they have. According to the new treaty, the two sides will cooperate on areas such as space, biology, peaceful use of atomic energy, IT, and so on. And these all things, it's necessary for North Korea to build nuclear submarines, SLBMs, ICBMs, and reconnaissance satellites, and other C4ISR capabilities. So under comprehensive strategic partnership, another thing to note is that two sides will mutually assist each other in removing the prevailing threat when a direct threat of armed invasion is created. So this is a military cooperation pact. And this is very concerning not only to South Korea, but to other US allies extending to the NATO members as well. Lastly, Seoul announced its commitment in further strengthening its ties with NATO. In his doorstep statement, President Yoon said, "European security and Indo-Pacific security is indivisible." And in the speech later, he mentioned it's the two sides of a same coin. Sure. So this was the message that South Korea had for the world, and it was successful in conveying these messages, also with the help of the IP4 members.
Thank you, Hyun Ji. So I sort of in general alluded to that inseparable language in my opening statement, and that was, I clocked that as well from President Yoon, something that Prime Minister Kishida has been saying for some time now. But so far as I know, that was the first time Yoon sort of reiterated that same framing. And it also went, just to the point on South Korea's Indo-Pacific strategy, I think it sort of went under the radar that on his way to Washington for the summit, Yoon went to Honolulu to Indo-PACOM, I think the first time in 27 years since the South Korean president has visited. Before it was Pacific Command, of course. I think Kim Yong-sam was the predecessor of his that had visited. And he talked about it being directly linked to the U.S.-South Korea alliance. And that sort of language is, I don't want to say, it is actually novel for a South Korean president to say that. So I think it's of a piece to this broader trajectory that you just discussed. I do want to actually ask one specific question, and maybe Kristian first, but anyone, please feel free to weigh in. There was the industrial capacity expansion pledge that the IP4 members were mentioned as potentially part of. Obviously, pledge is in the name, so this is aspirational sort of by definition. So I know this is something that's very future oriented, but Kristian or any of our panelists, could you maybe speak about your read on the industrial capacity expansion pledge that was made at NATO, and how this may be a conduit to further develop relations between NATO and IP4?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, obviously, this is linked to the issues that allies have faced with lowered stocks due to the Ukraine conflict, but in general, years of issues around stocks. So that's important to understand why we made the pledge and what it's linked to. But then, of course, cooperation with the Indo-Pacific partners who are very capable in this area is key, and it's already ongoing. And you see that with individual allies, the fighter jet program between Japan, France, and Italy and the UK. Then the Polish-Korean cooperation on defense industrial cooperation. So that's already happening on an individual level. And I think it's important to recognize also that NATO can provide an added value if we increase this cooperation between the partners and NATO NATO allies as well. So I see that as an area for the future, looking at the Ukraine war, but also beyond, where we can increase work with the four partners.
Do any of the other panelists want to weigh in on that?
I would just mention, I think it's quite interesting. At the NATO Public Forum, the Secretary General made a speech in which he discussed, among other things, what the IP4 and NATO were going to be cooperating on going forward. And in that one, he included all of the three things that came out in the final statement, which I think was cyber, disinformation, and technology. But he also included cooperation on defense industrial production. So my understanding is that that might have been a desired outcome as well, but maybe got left on the table between negotiations between different allies. But I'm curious to see how and when that does get picked up again, because certainly, as Korea has shown, you know, there's some additional capacity to fill those stocks among Indo-Pacific partners, and really kind of pulling them into the idea of coordinating that for both this conflict and future conflicts, I think would be quite important.
Hyun Ji or
Sure. So South Korea's defense industry has been promoted the past couple years, and South Korea exports I think 24% of its I'm blinking on the bit, but anyway, Europe is the key partner, one of the key partners for arms export for South Korea. And in this regard, one of the things that South Korea was really interested in cooperating with NATO members, NATO and also IP4 members, were this defense industry. So it's not just a government-led approach per se, but also talking to IP4 members. South Korea noticed that also bringing in private sector was important as well. So there's this element that really the member states can't really control, but was willing to incorporate the private sectors and defense industry to kind of join this the initiative and further cooperate on the pledge that you're talking about.
Kathryn, do you have anything to weigh in on?
Yeah, well, I mean, of course, this we've seen, of course, in the last few years. I don't think this can be separated from the push on the U.S. and Australia and UK for AUKUS, and that's been a keen focus from the U.S. and Australian and UK perspective, is integrating these defense industries, and that has gone well beyond this idea of just subs in Pillar 1, and Pillar 2 has really been about how do we integrate our defense industries, how do we align them, how do we get over some of the traditional blockages and obstacles that we've found in technology transfer and the ability to look forward and understand, our shortfalls for the region. So this has been a very top of mind focus for Australia more broadly, and how they are able to look at integrating not just with the US, but potentially other partners beyond AUKUS in the region. So I think this will be very welcome. And yes, as you said, just stated as a pledge, I see that as just further reinforcing what so many NATO and non-NATO partners are recognizing is a very urgent need to address these shortfalls that we've seen come out of the Ukraine crisis.
Yeah, I should circle back. Pledge is aspirational, but I think you've all rightly pointed out that this is building on what are existing concrete areas of cooperation. And I actually would highlight a recent article from an outside contributor on KI's website titled "The New Arsenal of Democracy: Enhancing the South Korea-NATO Relationship in the New Cold War." That's a mouthful. But it gets into to some of what you were discussing, Hyun Ji, about South Korea's defense exports and really how much it's ramped up in recent years with Poland and with others as well. And we'll share a link to that in the chat as we speak. We've been alluding to this, but maybe if we could burrow down into it a little bit more, how we see, and this is open from here, so just two-finger intervention, whoever wants to chime in. How do we see the NATO IP4 partnership evolving in the future? And one sort of additional question I have that's part of this is the question of more formal, formalizing it more or keeping it more informal, and the benefits and drawbacks to either of those approaches. Kristian mentioned some of the existing partnerships are formalized. This one is not. I think informality actually provides some benefits, but I will be interested to know what our different panelists think of this. So
I can jump in. This is something we looked at in the working group report that you mentioned. So I think this is a fascinating question because I think, as you said, this whole set of relationships, the IP4, is evolving rather quickly. So when we were looking at this question in 2022 and early 2023, the general sense was that there was no desire among the IP4 governments to further formalize the IP4 as a regional grouping. So as Kristian mentioned, NATO has a number of partnership groups that are basically on a regional basis, although not necessarily in terms of focus. But the IP4 is not one of them. The IP4 is just part of the global partners or partners across the globe, which is a broader set of international partners outside of the other three groupings. And, there's all kinds of questions about whether the IP4 now constitutes some sort of Indo-Pacific partnership grouping. And informally they do, but formally they do not. The other thing we found is that also on NATO's side, there was no desire to create a formal grouping, at least at that time, out of the IP4. And this has to do, I think, with broader existing and continuing to exist tensions within NATO among allies about where they see the Indo-Pacific as a priority versus other NATO priorities. Because although NATO certainly has agreed language on China and agreed language on the Indo-Pacific, and all NATO allies are, recognize the importance of the IP4 partners, beyond that, there is still a lot of differentiation between various allies and various groups of allies. So I think that's why you haven't seen formalization, but there's also been no drive from either side to really formalize this partnership. And that's because, as you mentioned, there are various benefits to informality, including there's more flexibility. It's slightly less on the radar in terms of what they can talk about. They can talk about China. They can talk about other things that, if it were a formal grouping, might cause more consternation from China and others. So I think there's a lot of benefits to keeping it as the way it is. In terms of going forward, I think the real question is how do these partners see the IP4 grouping? Do they see it as mostly just a function of NATO, in which it's easier for NATO to engage with them in the four, and it's practical for them to engage with NATO because they also get more attention as a group of four than any one of them would get individually? Or do they see it as potentially more strategically interesting in terms of being a platform for beyond just the NATO context, but also within the NATO context, really pushing forward regional priorities that the four agree on? And I think that's still an open question. One, because although all the IP4 partners have similar interests and views, they are not monolithic in any way. There's different priorities within each country for its relations with NATO and for what it wants from NATO in the region. So I think there is yet to emerge any kind of consensus on kind of what the IP4 want from the IP4. And I think that's a question we'll continue to see evolving.
Yeah, and not to speak for Kristian, but we could say the same for NATO, right? It is an organization, but it's a collective one of 32 nations, each of which has specific perspectives and limited resources. Any of the other panelists want to weigh in on that question of sort of formality vice informality?
If I may, I would say I cannot prejudice, of course, what decisions will be made and what allies will view as the best way to move forward. What I will say from my perspective, where I'm sitting, this partnership is working. We are able to meet at the highest level. We're meeting at ministerial level, at the ambassadorial level, and below in technical committees. We are working together. And again, I'll draw the attention to the flagship projects that we agreed. So the partnership works. From my perspective, whether it's formal or informal, that's secondary. And the important thing is that we talk, we share information, and that we work together. So I would focus on that. And as to the future, what we'll do, I hope we'll do more together. Again, the flagship projects outline the areas where we share interest and we want to do more together. But of course, NATO partnership cooperation, as I described, anything from language courses to exercises entails a lot of things that we can do still together. So there's more to explore, both individually and through the 4 countries together.
So
Yeah,
under
if I
current,
just jump. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
all right. So under current circumstances, I think it is highly likely that NATO and IP4 partnership will only become more valuable.
Highly
And
likely.
Highly likely that it will become more valuable. And now everyone's interest has heightened. Its strategic value has been exponentially increasing. From South Korea's perspective, as a long-standing ally of the United States, South Korea can strengthen NATO IP4 ties through the United States, and also strengthen the tie directly promoting bilateral and trilateral or minilaterals between and among IP4 members, and also strengthen South Korea direct tie with the NATO. And I think South Korea well understands that all these needs to be pursued simultaneously. So on that note, I do agree with what's been said. I do agree that formal, informal, it's a secondary question. It is working, and we like it, and we want it to work, right? So that's actually, but it also may sound a little contradictory, but you can pursue 2 routes at the same time. You can make it formal, but at the same time continue all these the bilaterals or trilaterals within the IP4 members. You can just keep working informally as well.
That's a good point. Yeah. Kathryn.
Yeah, I do. I don't have quite the same optimism that the relationship, as was just previously said, well, the kind of the proof has already been made of the importance of IP4 to NATO and vice versa into the future. I think that's still slightly dependent on the way that many of the NATO countries view both China and the Asia Pacific in terms of their own national security, especially depending on how the US is either pushing or not for this IP4 relationship. So the only argument I could really see for trying to more formalize that relationship would be to ensure that that relationship remains into the future. But I do full-heartedly agree that as of now, it is working in its current construct. And I'd also note that, of course, the NATO IP4 relationship is just one of the many ties that the IP4 countries have individually or in various groupings with many of the individual NATO members, with European countries. There are many other there's a lattice work of various multilateral groupings out there that are accomplishing a lot of the objectives that these IP4 countries have, both in the region and beyond. So it's not sort of the end-all be-all relationship moving forward to meet the security needs of the IP4 countries.
Those are good points, and thank you for sprinkling in a little pessimism. We all need some of that, skepticism at the very least. So it's been mentioned, and I myself mentioned it, how NATO expanded its strategic aperture, and of course, the strategic concept in 2022 is often cited as the sort of an inflection point in this process. It's also been mentioned that the recent Washington Summit declaration, there was a sort of a discursive escalation in some of the language that was used vis-a-vis China, calling it a decisive enabler of Russia's war against Ukraine through its so-called no limits partnership and its large-scale support for Russia's defense industrial base. The declaration further warned Beijing that it, quote, cannot enable the largest war in Europe in recent history without this negatively impacting its interests and reputation, end quote. Secretary General Stoltenberg has repeatedly assured that China is not an adversary of NATO, but he has declared that NATO has entered a new era of, quote, enduring competition with China. Of course, unsurprisingly, this has led to sort of vociferous rebuke from China, from Russia, from North Korea as well. I think they refer to it as an illegal document. And also from skepticism from analysts and scholars here in DC and elsewhere. And so it raises the question of NATO, not just with the Indo-Pacific, but in the Indo-Pacific. And we've been already sort of touching on some of this, but maybe if we could examine it more specifically, if developments in the Indo-Pacific can directly and do directly affect the Euro-Atlantic, and I believe they do, should we expect to see more emphasis and cooperation from NATO within the Indo-Pacific?
NATO is not naming China as the threat. It's like been mentioned, like a challenge, and it's getting a little severe. But South Korea, this is from South Korea's strategic point of view. What's important for South Korea is the economic security to counter Chinese economic coercion, but at the same time using China to kind of put pressure on Russia when it comes to DPRK-Russia relations. So I think NATO and South Korea share that notion that there is this value of working with China to counter Russia, NATO as well. The war in Ukraine, I think for economic perspective, China is a threat too. But when it comes to more imminent threat, it's actually coming from what's happening in Ukraine. So NATO members and I think South Korea actually see eye to eye at this. And I think what IP4 members can actually bring is how to work around these issues between NATO and the Indo-Pacific actors. And for South Korean perspective, this is very important.
Mirna?
I don't think you're going to see NATO in the Indo-Pacific in the way that we might think in terms of having assets, NATO-flagged assets in the Indo-Pacific anytime soon. And I don't actually think that you need that for NATO's relationships with the Indo-Pacific partners or for NATO's focus on the Indo-Pacific to be effective. Basically, the way that NATO is present, quote unquote, in the Indo-Pacific now is through its engagement with its four partners. It has observed some exercises among some of the partners with just observers, so it hasn't sent assets. And I think that's something that will probably continue and maybe strengthen a little bit in terms of increasing that. But the main reason you're not going to see a NATO military presence in the region is because, again, we go back to the NATO allies, and there's absolutely no consensus among NATO allies that that would be a positive thing. And frankly, there's mixed feelings, I think, among the IP4 partners as well. I think countries like Japan would see a NATO-flagged presence in the region as being a strong deterrence signal, but other partners have differing views. But again, I want to really emphasize that I don't think you need to see NATO in the Indo-Pacific physically present for cooperation with those partners and for NATO's impact on security in the region to be felt. And again, I think you can look at the way that the IP4 partners are cooperating on Ukraine as a perfect model. They're not sending troops to Ukraine. Sure. They're coordinating with NATO allies on material for Ukraine, on political and economic support or sanctions. And that's the same kind of, hopefully, support and coordination you could see from NATO allies in an Indo-Pacific contingency scenario in the future.
That's a good point. I might follow up on that later.
Two finger on this. So if we're talking about NATO presence in the Indo-Pacific, it's not like officially they've sent troops or anything, but there is this UNC, and the UNC still hosts the personnel from NATO. So there is this unofficial.
As individual member states or as NATO?
As
individual member states.
Yeah. And they don't define themselves as we're NATO,
Right.
individual
Yeah,
member
right.
states.
Right,
So that's
but
the
there
difference,
is this practical link that we can work
Indeed,
on.
yeah. And there's actually like, France, the UK, the Netherlands or Denmark and Germany, they've all sent assets to the region as well as national countries, which have cooperated and exercised with some of these partners. So certainly from the national level, yes.
Yeah, and just to follow your point, Andrea, because this is of interest to me as well. I mean, when we look at the UNC and its increased salience under the Yoon administration, the Aussies and the Kiwis have shown particular increased fidelity to the UNC, both UNC headquarters on the Korean Peninsula, but also in Japan, which is, of course, the fourth Indo-Pacific partner where UNC REAR is based. I understand that our virtual panelists are still with us, but not on the screen. Would either of you like to weigh in on this question I posed about NATO in the Indo-Pacific, as many people
Sure.
are asking it?
I can go with Kathryn. It's okay with that. So I think we need to demystify a bit this NATO in the Indo-Pacific, because there's a lot of disinformation around that, and the panelists there with you made a lot of good points on what it means, what it doesn't mean. Individual allies are present in the region, even with military assets. So that's one thing. Second, many times when I hear NATO going to the Indo-Pacific, what I read from Chinese and Russian disinformation is NATO enlargement, or as they say, NATO expansion in the region. Of course, that's impossible based on the Washington Treaty. NATO is and will remain a regional alliance, and that will not change. So that is something we need to debunk again and again. Then the flip side of this coin is, of course, Chinese presence in the Euro-Atlantic. And we just heard recently about the Chinese-Belarusian exercises. There were military exercises earlier between China and Russia. And indeed, as you mentioned, the summit pointed out the support as that China is giving as a decisive enabler for Russia for its war against Ukraine. So I would rather that we focus on that. That's actually happening, and is a question: Chinese presence, Chinese influence in Euro-Atlantic and on Euro-Atlantic security, rather than this esoteric and not well-defined NATO presence in the Pacific.
I like that you said that, Kristian. It seems a very commonplace observation to focus on what's actually happening as opposed to what might happen in the future. But I think it's actually a weighty point that's worth repeating. Kathryn, would you like to weigh in?
I agree with everything that's been said, and specifically on this idea of NATO in the Pacific, if there were to be potentially any talk about that, or just kind of this misunderstanding of what that could mean, that is also very readily and quickly used as disinformation material. We see that being used by China in Southeast Asia with the Pacific partners, Pacific Islands partners. And so in some ways, it almost hurts us even more if that's not more readily clarified in the international space. So I completely agree with that previous point. And I also agree that I think what we would be hoping to see at the very least, however, is if there were a conflict of some sort in the Indo-Pacific, that sort of support for countries perhaps from a defense industrial base, or by in cyber collaboration or other combating of transnational threats in such a way as we're seeing right now with the IP4 countries' support for Ukraine in Europe. And I think that's what those member countries, where the IP4 countries, would really be looking for.
I have other questions, but I want to turn to our audience Q&A. So if you do have any of those, please pop them in the chat box, and we do have a few lined up. This actually comes from one of our own, Mark Tokla, KEI's vice president. And he asks, it seems like NATO and the G7 are filling the vacuum left by the UN, the WTO, and the OSCE paralysis. Are NATO and the G7 coordinating? When will Australia and South Korea join the G7 to further bring the organizations into alignment? There are two questions there.
I can take a stab at that. I'm not a G7 expert by any means, but last year Japan was president of the G7, and everybody else on the G7 is a NATO member. So it was interesting that Japan, as a NATO partner, was the president, and Japan actually invited both Korea and Australia and many other countries to join the G7 meetings that it hosted. So there's certainly that desire on the part of at least Japan to kind of bring in more countries into that fold in terms of the impact that G7 and its statements can make. So I don't know the extent to which the G7 as a entity is coordinating with NATO, but again, their membership is largely overlapping. So I think to that extent, they're inherently coordinating in some ways.
Well, in my opinion, it's not like for South Korea, it's not like they can choose and pick. So it's in a really dire situation. Recently, Russia actually brought the Ukraine war to the peninsula. So it is really diplomatically and also it's very struggling in a way that it has not been before. For South Korea, it doesn't matter which organization, it doesn't matter if it's official or unofficial, it doesn't matter if it's part of the recognized membership country or not, but it's actually what boils down to is actually using all these different channels very actively and dynamically to promote the coordination with all these different states that has similar common values, and the alliances to actually promote the peace and stability on the Korean Peninsula, because that's obviously the first purpose of all this. So for me, when I come to questions like this, it doesn't matter. Really, what matters is what's happening right now and what we can do. And as long as it's practical, that's what's important.
Kristian or Kathryn?
I'd like that it doesn't matter as long as it's practical, that's okay. I would fully sign up to that. And I also like the comment about inherent coordination. Obviously, G7 and NATO are very different entities with different mandates, outlooks, but the membership, of course, is overlapping, and Japan is one of the closest partners of NATO. So I leave it at that. I would just have one philosophical problem with a NATO G7 filling vacuum of these more universal organizations, at least for UN and WTO. That's not possible. That's a totally different setup of problems, members to deal with. So I don't think there's the vacuum which is there due to the authoritarian countries' pushback against the order that these universal entities are upholding. NATO cannot fill that vacuum. It's a different purposed organization. So I would just question that part of Mark's question.
Kathryn?
Yeah, I agree with Kristian. I don't think we should be conflating the purpose or sort of watering down the objectives of what these major organizations are about. And if I could second or third it doesn't really matter. It's more about what's practical. Australia and others are certainly involved in the G7 in partnership ways, joining the climate club for Australia's part and others. So I'm not sure in terms of the question of Australia joining or something like that, if that's even necessary. It's more about what is going to practically meet their national security needs and objectives. And if they see that as a hole that needs to be filled in order to be able to voice their needs on the global stage, then perhaps they would. But I just don't see that as something top of list at the moment.
Thank you. We have another question online here, and Mirna, you mentioned Southeast Asian nations. You didn't mention ASEAN specifically, but that comes to mind. And of course, the IP4 countries' relations with ASEAN, it's sort of critical to all their regional foreign policies, and also Pacific Island nations, I think you mentioned. And so this relates to this question, which is, are there any other Indo-Pacific partners that would make sense to include under an informal structure, sort of building on the IP4, maybe not calling it an IP5 or IP6, but if there were other Indo-Pacific partners, who might they be that would be good to involve in some of these?
You mean Indo-Pacific partners of NATO or just countries that could cooperate with the IP4?
I'm going to go with the latter to begin with.
Okay. I mean, the latter is much easier because for the former question, as Kristian mentioned, it's a lot more complicated. Those countries have to want to be NATO partners, and NATO has to want those countries to be partners with NATO. And I don't see a lot of that available right now in the region. But in terms of coordinating with the IP4, again, I think there's possibly some candidates. India is always thrown around as an important player, but I think India has its own views about cooperation and coordination and non-alignment. So I think maybe, I'm not sure where India would stand on that, frankly. The Philippines is another one that gets tossed around, especially now under the new administration. They've been much more forward on pushing back against China publicly in terms of their contested territory with China. And they've been much more solicitous of both support from the US and from Japan and other allies and partners in the region. So I can certainly see them being interested in that. I don't know to the extent that I have a thought on whether that has to be through the IP4. I mean, again, it's already happening bilaterally. So Japan, US, Philippines trilateral cooperation is happening. India's in the Quad already with Australia and Japan. I'm not sure how much the IP4 as an entity would be the right or necessary mechanism for that, but certainly I can see it happening.
Anyone, maybe I'll defer to our virtual panelists first. Any further insight on that question?
Yeah, I can. When we were talking earlier about the future of IP4, it actually occurred to me that I think the Philippines is a really natural country to consider here, even to the extent of making a potential IP5 if that were to happen in the future. Obviously, as was just mentioned, this would have to be something that was desired both on the Philippines side and on NATO's side. But just when we look at the evolution of the Philippines cooperation and their pushback and their strength in the region in terms of standing up for their own national security. When we look at the recent development of the Squad, as it's been called, between Japan, Australia, the Philippines, and the US, and some of the activity there, all very focused on security and defense. I think there is a lot of rationale for further conversation with the Philippines in that IP4 context, especially when it comes to this idea of what happens in the Indo-Pacific, what happens specifically in the South China Sea, affecting European security and affecting NATO members. So I think the Philippines is a natural country to consider in that context.
Kristian?
I'll just add to that without naming any specific countries in the region. Two things. One is we already have existing contacts with countries in the region who are not our partners, but contacts in terms of dialogue, but also practical activities sporadically that happen. And second, I'll just remind that in the strategic concept, when we talked about the Indo-Pacific region, allies already made clear that they're willing to strengthen dialogue and cooperation with existing partners, but also with new potential partners in the future. And this openness for new interlocutors, engaging new interlocutors, not just in the Indo-Pacific, but globally, has been in place at least since 2011, since NATO's partnership policy has been put into place. So by no means NATO is against engaging new countries, developing new partnerships, and that's happening in other regions as well. But I cannot report of any specific work towards a new partnership being worked at. And thank you for reminding that, of course, there has to be an interest for that. We are not in the business of hunting down new partners. They have to come to NATO first, so that we can judge whether we have mutual interest in cooperation.
Yes, we will not use the language of NATO hunting down new partners.
Yes, I knew that was a big error.
Some others might use that language, but we will.
Please not. I really hope that this will not be an excerpt.
No, we'll expunge it from the record. Hyun Ji.
Yes, I think you already mentioned this, but similar to Japan, I think other US allies in the region, Philippines, of course, Thailand is another one. We can strengthen cooperations with them in terms of more strengthening the regional security. but also in terms of economic ties and tech transfer. You can also look to Indonesia, Vietnam. So in terms of, say, telecommunication technology, IT, all these things are also important for them and also important for us to gain strengthen ties with them to strengthen the partnership within the region. So these are the other candidates. And also another thing I would like to point out is that South Korea has been exporting a lot of the weapons and aircrafts, for training purposes as well, to these Southeast Asian countries. So beginning with that, South Korea is promoting closer ties with, promoting like a full package to service the airplanes that are exported, also training services as well, and training them to maintain the weapons and weapon platform. And so these are what Korea is working on, in addition to the pre-existing, the aids and whatnots.
I assure this is not coordinated, Hyun Ji, but you keep giving me opportunities to tee up KEI, a sort of shameless self-promotion, which is that our flagship journal, Korea Policy, examines triangular relations of different kinds in the region. And there are two of those papers look at US, Korea, Indonesia, US, Korea, Vietnam relations. So I would suggest our viewers take a look at those. There's a lot of really insightful analysis in those. We're getting near the end of our program. I don't see another online question. I have another one of my own. I did not prep anyone for this, and I take Kristian's point to heart about not getting too bogged down in speculating about future potentialities. So feel free to sit this one out, Kristian, if you'd like. But of course, many people are wondering about the outcome of the November election in the US. It's the elephant in the room. And it's a very realistic potential. And so it raises, well, a multitude of questions, but one specifically, which is if there is a change of administration in the US, and the US is far less supportive of NATO as an organization, but also in the context of Ukraine's continued struggle against Russia's invasion, what potential effect could this have on NATO IP4 cooperation? I could see different logics leading to it sort of not falling by the wayside, but being less prevalent. But I could also see such a development actually spurring a deepening of the cooperation in some ways. So I'm curious, without getting too overly speculative, what our panelists might think about that. If there is a less sort of committed, less present US in a Euro-Atlantic context, what effect could it have on this partnership?
Should we try poor Kathryn first?
Let's go with Kathryn first. Yeah, I feel like she's not on the screen, but she's with us.
Noted. Yeah, thank you all. So, obviously I've done quite a bit of travel over this past year in New Zealand and Australia, and this is question 1, 2, and 3 that we get, not specifically about NATO, but just in terms of what next and how they should best approach a potential Trump administration in terms of international relations in general. I think, this was probably very top of mind for IP4 partners, frankly, going into this last NATO summit, and part of the reason why strengthening these ties, institutionalizing these types of meetings, even if they remain informal, demonstrating the importance of the Indo-Pacific to NATO and NATO partners. The US has clearly been a large proponent of the IP4 and really motivating that along. And so I think it's very much top of mind for, at least I know, Australia and New Zealand. What would happen in terms of their relationship with NATO? Would NATO still be as interested in pursuing this relationship and ensuring that there's this connectivity here? I think we've seen with both, the statement coming out of NATO, the statements out of NATO, the commitments, that there is a broader recognition continuing this relationship with IP4. I think IP4 countries will need to continue to demonstrate that necessity for IP4 existing and continue to make the case, if you will, especially if the US does start to step back a little bit from promoting the IP4 in the NATO context. And so I think that's something that all 4 countries are likely already considering and thinking about. And I'd be surprised if they weren't already talking amongst themselves about what might be next and next steps.
Kristian, not to put you on the spot, but would you like to weigh in?
Yeah, sure. And I have an easy job because I can just relate to Secretary General Stoltenberg in 2 ways. One is we don't deal with hypotheticals, so I'm not answering a hypothetical. And the second is what he said, that regardless of the outcome in the US elections, he's absolutely convinced, and past experience shows that the US will remain a key pivotal ally, also when it comes to being a catalyst for NATO's cooperation with the Indo-Pacific. So thankfully, Secretary General Stoltenberg helped me in this question.
Thank you. And my 2 in-person panelists.
I think there's still this shared importance for this to work between NATO and IP4 members, IP4 states. So even with relatively less support from the United States, I think it will be still rolling. Another thing to note is that regardless of what next administration will pursue, China's stance against China, I don't think it's something that will change. So we have that constant, even though some U.S. might somewhat feel for Russia, China is still on the opposite side. So that's something that we can further promote to enhance the cooperation among NATO and the IP4 members. For South Korean perspective, unless any measures or measures taken threatens U.S. RK-U.S. ties, RK-U.S. security alliance, it's going to be okay. But if it does, in any case, say U.S. threaten or declares that it's going to pull out the ground forces, or something drastic like that happens, then it will be very difficult. South Korea will be in a very difficult position to further pursue these cooperations.
I have 3 things. One is a caveat for the other 2. So I would start with echoing what Kathryn said. Basically, I think the heavy lifting on the IP4 relationships, both as a group and as individually, has largely been done up until now. And the point going forward will be to deepen the work that's already been done. So to deepen what's potentially available through the IP4 as a group, to deepen the individual partnerships that these countries have with NATO. And that, I think, has been institutionalized to a degree. Also, as Kristian mentioned, in terms of we're meeting, at the highest levels, we're meeting in the different levels of the NAC, we're meeting on working level, et cetera. That I don't think requires continued U.S. pushing or support. So again, I think that level will continue. In terms of motivation, this is where I don't really know. And again, I think this is an evolving question, because I think to start with, for all 4 of these countries, maybe less so for New Zealand, but certainly for the other 3, part and parcel of their interest in NATO has to do with their alliance with the United States. And so to the extent that the US is not as involved in NATO or doesn't care as much about that relationship, I don't know the impact that might have on how the partners value this relationship. But I suspect that there has been so much engagement at this point that the partners have seen that there is also benefits to just direct connections with European allies. And so I do think that will sort of mitigate that potential caveat a little bit. The third thing I would say is that it's not only what happens, certainly the US election is important for a lot of things, but there's other elements at play here. For example, what will happen in Korea? Will the next president be as forward-leaning on NATO as President Yoon has? And then most importantly, potentially, incoming Secretary General Rutte. So, certainly Stoltenberg himself has been a strong advocate of IP4 and Indo-Pacific as being a region of importance for NATO. He's done a lot of work individually, visiting these countries, putting emphasis on the region. And he's had a lot of people around him who have provided the sort of intellectual and sort of strategic sort of thought support for why that matters. I don't know to the extent that which Rutte is that focused on the region or will continue to have that level of personal interest. So I think that's another sort of question that we will have to see going forward.
All very good points. Well, we've come to the end of our time. I want to thank all of our panelists, both here and virtually. This has been a very insightful discussion for me specifically. It's given me ideas to sort of build on future research and writing and programs. And so I would encourage all of our viewers to stay tuned for just such programs and products that KEI will continue to produce, as well as, I'm sure, all of our participants today. I do just want to close very briefly, and I promised them I would make this brief, with a heartfelt shout out to our Vice President, Mark Tokola, and our Senior Director, Troy Stangarone, both of whom are leaving KEI. Tomorrow is their last day. So we will be losing, I think, upwards of 30 years of expertise and experience at KEI specifically. So it is a huge loss for us as an organization, but we wish them both the best as Mark retires to the state of Washington, undoubtedly the better of the two Washingtons, I might add. And Troy moves on to a new position, which he himself will announce, so I'll allow him to do that. But his new organization will benefit handsomely from his expertise and his collegiality. So I just want to thank them both for the service they've provided and just being wonderful colleagues, especially for my brief 2 years here at KEI. And thank you, everyone, for joining us online.